we've evolved into big, passive zoo animals. In many ways, we traded a free and active consciousness for mindless consumption, a golden cage. But it turns out the keys to that cage are also the keys to the kingdom. At our current point in human history, it can feel like we've arrived at an endpoint, or at least we're quickly hurtling towards it. I don't mean any sort of apocalypse per se, we don't even have to go that far. But the fact is, our lives as human beings on this planet have changed more in the last 100 years than they have in the thousands of years before that. And our system of late-stage free market capitalism seems to many like a natural culmination, a ceiling. We are done, right?
You know, Francis Fukuyama, and I think it was 1989 when he wrote The End of History and the Last Man, right? It was the Berlin Wall came down, and they were like, okay, man, free market democracy won, that's settled. You know, this is the pinnacle of human organization, and it's a steady state from here. We've literally ended history. There's nothing more to figure out.
This school of thought has long historical precedent and goes back to our perception of time itself. To explain this, we'll actually have to go pretty deep, so bear with us.
The Hebrew invention of the alpha in the beginning, right? Everything started. And then the omega at the end, everything will culminate, is so profoundly baked into Western philosophical thought that it created time's arrow, right? It went from Ouroboros, the serpent that eats its tail, the cyclical time, to time's arrow. And in fact, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Ilya Prigogine wrote a book specifically about that, right? And so you're like, okay, so that is so deeply structured that almost all of our stories are stories of triumphant ascent and progress.
This perception of time, presupposing a start and an endpoint to everything, extends even further, because where every beginning has a definitive end, every question also has a definitive answer, and every problem a definitive solution. This is largely the way we've approached meaning in our society, and it has driven humankind to great achievement for centuries. Our discoveries, our progress, and the way we organize our lives are all built on that ideology. It has driven us to the point that we're at right now. It has given our consciousness a very rigid and singular focus.
The idea that, post-French Enlightenment, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, five senses, and empiricism, scientific materialism, all of those things were an incredibly powerful focusing lens that has created all the innovation and all the breakthroughs and all the developments that, we live in and enjoy. And it's also a terrible thing to be stuck in exclusively all the time. It's a little bit like the radio dial of our consciousness, and the range of our consciousness sort of got rusted shut in just one position only.
In other words, our societies have developed rapidly, and we've gotten stuck in a state of consciousness that made these developments possible. But is that really so bad? Well, we can all see and feel the effects. Increasing inequality, looming environmental disasters, and the fact that's almost become conventional wisdom now. Those of us who live in giant cities with the world at our fingertips, we're as unhappy as we ever were.
We've just kind of defined our 21st century normal, right? It's a lot of cortisol, stress hormones, norepinephrine, adrenaline, fight-flight response, vigilance, micro-PTSD, and trying to solve things mentally, cognitively. That when you get to shift that dial, you actually get to pick up a different bandwidth of information, and we get to shift our physiology. So Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, who's a brilliant neuroscientist, wrote a great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it was basically the idea of, look, when animals face threat, challenge, 1 minute the zebra's grazing, the next minute a lion bounds out of the grasses. They run like hell. Maybe one of them's unlucky, but the other ones 15 minutes later are back to grazing, right? They task switch. Humans don't. Right? We get fixated. So we're driving back through traffic, or we're lying in bed at night rehashing a conversation from work or with our spouse or whatever it is, and we don't have an off switch.
But there is an off switch. We're just conditioned not to see it.
A flow state is really just a placeholder for what has gone by 100 different names through history in different times and places. Right? And it used to be understood as, for the Greeks, they would talk about the muses kind of descending, and then there would be this sort of extraordinary ability to express or connect or invent or create. Sort of Christian tradition in the Middle Ages, it would be notions of grace or charisma. But then there was a kind of a series of experiments in the 20th century. One of them was by Abraham Maslow. Instead of just interviewing people with religious or spiritual beliefs, interviewed atheists. And realized, oh wow, you guys have the same exact experience, you just don't attribute it to a divine or supernatural presence. Fascinating, right? So that's when Abraham Maslow coined the term peak experiences, because it had to be a little bit broader. It had to include, this isn't just faith-based. And then Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, a professor at the University of Chicago, continued that work, and he started interviewing everybody from rock climbers and alpinists and action sports athletes, all the way to Japanese motorcycle gangs and Korean grandmothers and, populations all around the world, different abilities, different physicality, different areas of interest, and found that all sorts of people were getting into these experiences. And one of the consistent adjectives or descriptors of that experience was that it was fluid, or that it was flowy, that it wasn't forced, that it just kind of effortlessly emerged from this experience.
We all experience flow in our lives. We all have peak experiences, as far and few between as they may be. Flow is about being fully in the moment to moment. I know you probably read that embroidered on a pillow somewhere, but if we can manage to actually do it, it can be life-changing. Because it means that some of those aggressive, overly critical voices in our head will recede into the background until they're not there at all.
There's fascinating neuroanatomical reasons for that, and all the sort of what's under the hood of it. But basically, we get drawn into the deep present. We cease obsessing about the past or the future, and generally our inner critic, that sort of constant narrative voice in our minds, that's often usually not that kind. It might have embodied the voice of a parent or a coach or a particularly traumatizing professor or whatever it is, but that's our inner critic, and that goes quiet. And as a result of those things, we tend to have access to more information and inspiration than we normally do.
So this is what flow really feels like. But how do we get there? Well, we go to places that actually require our undivided attention.
In the mountains, feedback is instant. And that idea that when you get outside of the civilized world, where you go past where the sidewalk ends, we get much tighter feedback loops on our leadership and on our choices and on our actions. And that can be as simple as I didn't look where I was going and fell off a cliff. Or I didn't secure my sleeping bag and now it rolled down to the bottom of the stream and it's soaking wet and I have to sleep in it for 3 nights until it dries. Or I'd go into the natural sublime, a wild and rugged place where you're outside of clock time and you're in geologic time. You're literally looking at 1 million years, and the story told in the sandstone. You're seeing sunrises and sunsets and shooting stars and all of these things. It's a profound reset. And, people have gone to the wilderness to seek inspiration and renewal for thousands of years. That's not a new approach, but it can be profound. And then to also get deeply into our bodies and to experience the sharp edge of surviving and thriving versus just feathering our nest, just adding one more feature to our gilded cage, right? That can be profoundly inspiring and renewing. And to do it with peers, to do it with people that are not, dependent or beholden to you, that are actually equally capable and competent, and can offer you feedback when you're not sitting in your corner office, when you're not controlling the narrative, but when you're out there on the raggedy edge of, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know if I can do this, and the ability to support each other, and the ability to find where our deeper edges are and begin polishing them becomes a profound gift of renewal.
What Jamie is getting at here is that you don't have to do any of this all by yourself. In fact, you shouldn't. We typically see any kind of personal growth or self-actualization as something very intimate and personal, and it is. But that doesn't mean it should take place in a vacuum. It's one of the most inspiring things about all of this, the idea of group flow.
One of the most fascinating findings from the field has emerged is that group flow, so the idea of not just me having that experience at a potter's wheel, or having that experience composing music or sliding down a mountain on skis, not just me by myself doing it, but me doing it with other people, is twice as rewarding. We actually get twice the neurochemical boost than we do by ourselves. So that's if we go skiing together or if we're listening to music together. But the final piece, and I think this is stated or unstated goals of the Argonauts, which is when you actually end up in, so what I just described, the 2x return, is sort of what would be called parallel play. Like we're both doing the same thing within eyesight next to each other, right? But then there's interdependent flow, which is much more like a jazz band or a football team, where we're doing the thing together, and in order for me to get there, you've got to get there, and then we get there and do the thing together. And that's actually 3 times, it's 300% more rewarding.
Now, finding and sharing flow, entering that different state of consciousness, will make us more aware and more awake and more productive people. Once we start seeing that there is a future that we can help build, we can start pouring our resources and our innovations into things that make life better for the people living on this planet, for the long haul. Because if we want to keep being creators, innovators, and entrepreneurs, we have to find a way for that to service other people, our communities. And we have to make sure that these communities stay alive for us to serve.
Right? And think we don't need more plastic widgets. We don't need more weapons of war. We don't need more apps that replace our mothers doing our laundry or delivering our groceries or cooking our food, right? We need, and whether you sign off on the UN's SDG goals or whatever, it's like, take your pick. There's long lists of things that we desperately need. And let's put our efforts into innovating those. And whether that's the X Prizes and those kinds of challenges. If you think of World War II, if you think of like, hey, there were all these factories. I mean, even in COVID, right? There was this massive conversion with 3M and other big companies into making ventilators, into generating masks. Like, we've got all this infrastructure, we've got all this logistics, we've got all this know-how. How do we direct it away from basically mindless and unsustainable consumption into actually innovating our way forward with the best we've got? And I think, leaders of companies, leaders of organizations have asymmetric capacity to change the system for the better.
That's it for Mint for this week. I'm Cassandra with the Argonauts, and I'll see you next time. If you like what you just saw, make sure to subscribe and check out our other videos.